The gavel struck the bench like a death sentence, but as the judge smirked at the innocent man before her, she didn't realize the internal security files were already tracking her every move. She thought she was the one holding the power, but in a city built on an organized scheme, she was just the next name on the hit list. The gavel came down with a sharp final crack that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Judge Eleanor Vance didn't just preside, she performed. She leaned back in her leather chair, her lips curled into that signature smirk that had become notorious in the city's legal circles. Across the bench stood Marcus Thorne, a man whose only crime, as far as I could tell, was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was dressed in a suit that had seen better days, clutching a file folder with white-knuckled intensity. He was intelligent, articulate, and completely out of his depth against the systemic machine Eleanor represented. "Mr. Thorne," she drawled, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy, "your attempts to plead your innocence are becoming increasingly tiresome. We are dealing with a serious matter here. You've been implicated in a network involving illegal substances, and frankly, your continued protestations of ignorance regarding the contents of that locker are insulting to this court's intelligence." Marcus looked up, his eyes tired but burning with a fierce, quiet defiance. "Your Honor, I've told you. I was hired as a courier for a legitimate delivery service. I didn't know what was in the packages. I've lived my life trying to get out of the shadow of my upbringing, and I wouldn't throw it all away for a petty delivery." Eleanor laughed, a dry, brittle sound that made the public gallery shift uncomfortably. "A legitimate service that just happens to be a front for an organized scheme? Please, you aren't a victim, Mr. Thorne. You're a cog in a machine that ruins lives. I think it's time this court stops being lenient with people of your background. You think you can walk into my courtroom and play the martyr? I see right through you." I sat in the back row, my pen hovering over my notepad, watching the power dynamic play out. As a court reporter, I had seen Elena destroy many people, but this felt different. She wasn't just judging him. She was relishing the power, projecting her own deep-seated biases onto a man who was clearly terrified. She had already decided his fate before the defense had even finished their opening statement. She was leaning toward handing him an enormous prison sentence, decades of his life, based on flimsy, circumstantial evidence tied to that organized scheme. As the proceedings broke for a brief recess, I watched Elena walk back to her chambers, her head held impossibly high. She passed by Marcus, who was being escorted by bailiffs, and she didn't even look at him. She didn't see a human being. She saw a statistic she could manipulate to bolster her reputation as a tough-on-crime magistrate. I felt a knot of anger tighten in my stomach. She was a woman who lived for order, for the ironclad control of the law, and she took pride in her reputation for being untouchable. But what Elena didn't know, what no one in that room knew yet, was that the shadows she played with were starting to lengthen. While she was busy tearing apart Marcus's life, a quiet investigation was unfolding behind the scenes. Earlier that morning, I had overheard a conversation in the hallway, a brief, hushed exchange between two men in dark suits who had been lurking near the clerk's office. They weren't there for the trial. They were part of a secret internal security review that had been quietly auditing the judges in this district for months. Their focus wasn't on the petty thieves or the street-level couriers. Their focus was on the corruption at the very top. I had seen the way Eleanor's hand shook when she checked her phone, the way she kept glancing at the side door of the courtroom where a man in a gray suit stood watch, never once taking his eyes off her. It wasn't the look of a judge overseeing justice. It was the look of a woman waiting for the other shoe to drop. The afternoon session began with an eerie stillness. Elena looked pale, the smirk replaced by a tight, rigid line of her mouth. She called the court to order, but her voice lacked its usual bite. She glanced at the door again, her eyes wide, panic hidden behind a practiced mask of indifference. Suddenly, the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. It wasn't the bailiff. It was two agents from the Internal Security Office, flanked by local law enforcement. They didn't walk toward the gallery. They marched straight down the center aisle, their boots clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. The room went deathly silent. Even the air seemed to grow thin. Marcus Thorne looked confused, shifting in his seat, while the prosecutor scrambled to stand, his face draining of all color. Elena gripped the sides of her bench, her knuckles white. She tried to maintain her authority, her voice trembling just enough for the front rows to catch it. "This is an interruption of a formal proceeding," she snapped, though it sounded like a plea. "State your business or leave immediately." The lead agent stopped just a few feet from the bench. He reached into his coat, pulling out a sealed document that seemed to suck all the light out of the room. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, Elena Vance, we have completed our review. Based on evidence linking your private financial accounts to the organized scheme currently under investigation, you are being detained for a mandatory internal inquiry. And that's not all. We have evidence of an attempt to frame innocent parties to cover your tracks. We are here to serve a warrant for your arrest." The gallery gasped, a collective sound of shock that filled the rafters. Elena's face went translucent, the veneer of the all-powerful judge cracking in an instant. She stood up, her robe catching on the chair, and as she stepped down from the dais, the handcuffs clicked into place. Not on a criminal, but on the woman who had spent her career putting everyone else in them. As she was led toward the very same holding cells she had sent so many others to, she tripped, her gaze meeting mine for a single, terrified second. In that look, I saw it all. She hadn't just been judging the law, she had been running from it. And as the heavy steel door slammed shut behind her, I realized that the nightmare of Marcus Thorne had only been the beginning of the judge's undoing. The silence that followed the slamming of the courtroom doors was heavy, almost suffocating. Marcus Thorne remained in his chair, his shackles clinking softly as he leaned forward, his mouth slightly agape as he processed the scene. The prosecutor was frantically gathering his papers, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped a stack of documents onto the floor. The public gallery, which only moments before had been a theater of judgment and mockery, was now a hive of whispers, confusion, and shock. I stayed in my seat, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I knew this wasn't just a simple case of a judge being caught with her hand in the cookie jar. This was a surgical strike. The internal security team hadn't just stumbled upon something. They had been hunting for this moment. As I watched the agents march Elena Vance toward the back exit, her heels tapping a frantic, uneven rhythm against the linoleum, I realized the irony was almost too sharp to bear. She had spent years lecturing men like Marcus on the sanctity of the law, on the moral clarity required to uphold it, while all along she had been the most compromised person in the room. I left the courtroom as quickly as I could, my notes clutched against my chest. I knew the building would soon be crawling with reporters, hungry for the scandal of the century. My car was in the basement parking lot, a dark concrete labyrinth that felt particularly cold today. I was halfway to my vehicle when I heard the distinct, sharp echo of footsteps behind me. Not one person, but two. I froze, my keys dangling from my hand, the metal cold against my skin. "Miss Miller?" a voice called out, smooth and devoid of any warmth. I turned around. Two men in charcoal gray suits, identical in their stoic expressions, blocked the path to the elevator. These were the same men I'd seen whispering near the clerk's office earlier that morning. They didn't look like standard security. They looked like shadows given human form. "Yes," I managed, my voice sounding thinner than I would have liked. "We understand you were the primary court reporter for Judge Vance's final session," the taller one said, stepping forward. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't have to. "We're going to need your notes. Everything from the last 3 months, including the off-the-record observations you keep in that private log." My stomach turned. They knew about the log. I only kept it as a personal habit, a way to keep track of the discrepancies in Elena's rulings, the times she ignored evidence or favored certain defense attorneys who were clearly part of the organized scheme she protected. "Those are my personal property," I said, trying to stand my ground. "They aren't part of the official court record." "Everything is part of the record now," the man replied, stepping into my personal space. The air around him smelled of stale coffee and something metallic, like cleaning fluid. "You see, Miss Miller, Judge Vance wasn't working alone. The investigation we're conducting is extensive. If you want to keep your career, or perhaps avoid being brought in as a material witness to a conspiracy involving multiple counts of obstruction, you will hand over that notebook." Right now. I looked down at my bag, where the leather-bound notebook was tucked away. It contained names, dates, and specific instances of judicial misconduct that reached far higher than just Elena. It was the kind of information that could burn the entire district court to the ground. If I handed it over to these men, it would disappear into a black hole of internal bureaucracy, and the truth would die with it. I need to speak to my editor first, I said, feigning a sudden burst of professional protocol. There are legal protections for journalists. I can't just hand over raw investigative materials. The second man, the shorter one with the cold, dead eyes, chuckled. It was a sound that didn't reach his face. Legal protections, you say? You're in a basement, Miss Miller. No one is coming to save you, and the law you're so fond of is currently being scrubbed clean. Elena Vance didn't just take bribes, she facilitated a network of illegal weapons trafficking and handled the distribution of dangerous materials. She was the anchor. You're just a witness who saw too much. He reached into his jacket, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to pull out a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a slim, black burner phone and dialed a number. He held it out to me. Your editor is on the line. He's already been briefed. If you want to keep your life, you'll cooperate. I took the phone with trembling fingers, pressing it to my ear. My editor's voice came through, but it was hollow, distant, and completely stripped of his usual gruff authority. Do what they say, Clara, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Whatever you have. It's not just a story anymore. It's a death sentence. Just give them the book and go home. Forget you were ever in that courtroom. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart racing, as the reality of the situation crashed over me. This wasn't a court case anymore. It was a cleanup operation, and I was the final piece of evidence that needed to be erased. As I looked up, the two men shifted, their posture becoming predatory, closing the distance between us in the confined space of the parking garage. The notebook, Miss Miller, the taller one repeated, his hand reaching for my bag. I clutched it to my chest, my mind racing for a way out. I looked towards the exit ramp, but a black sedan was pulling into the entrance, blocking the path, its headlights blinding me in the dark. I was cornered. I took a deep breath, realizing that if I gave them what they wanted, I would be a ghost, and the story of Marcus Thorne and the corrupt judge would be buried forever. In a moment of sheer desperation, I did the only thing I could. I threw the heavy notebook across the concrete floor, sending it skittering toward the shadows near the back wall, and bolted in the opposite direction. "Get her!" one of them shouted, their voices echoing off the concrete. I sprinted toward the maintenance staircase, my lungs burning, the sound of heavy boots pounding on the pavement closing in behind me. Just as I reached the door and shoved it open, I felt a hand grab the back of my coat, jerking me backward with such force that I fell hard against the concrete stairs. I scrambled to get up, but the shorter man was there, looming over me, his hand raised. He wasn't reaching for my notebook anymore. He was reaching for his holster. "You really should have listened to your editor," he hissed, his face twisted into a mask of pure malice as he pulled out a piece of illegal weaponry and leveled it at my chest. The metallic click of the safety being disengaged echoed through the stairwell, a sound so sharp it felt like a physical blow. I didn't think. I acted on pure primal instinct. As the man loomed over me, his thumb steady on the mechanism of the weapon, I swung my heavy messenger bag with everything I had left. It connected with his wrist, the force of the leather strap catching him off guard. The weapon clattered to the concrete floor, sliding into the darkness of the stairwell's lower landing. He roared in frustration, lunging for me, but I was already moving. I scrambled up the stairs, my boots slipping on the slick concrete. Behind me, the taller agent shouted something unintelligible, his heavy footsteps thundering up the stairs. I didn't look back. I reached the first-floor landing and burst through the fire door, spilling out into the chaotic, rain-slicked alleyway behind the courthouse. The cold air hit my lungs like needles, but I didn't slow down. My head was spinning. Everything I thought I knew about the legal system, the scales of justice, the sanctity of the bench, was a lie. These men weren't law enforcement. They were cleaners for the very network Elena Vance had been protecting. The internal security team that had arrested her was just an internal power struggle between factions of an organized scheme, and I had somehow stumbled into the crossfire. I dashed behind a row of overflowing industrial dumpsters, pressing my back against the cold brick wall. My breath came in ragged, jagged gasps. I needed a way out, but the alley was a dead end, blocked by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The sound of a heavy door slamming open echoed from the building behind me. "She can't have gone far," a voice snarled, the shorter one, his hand presumably bruised from my bag. "The perimeter is locked. Find her." I pulled my phone from my pocket, shaking violently. No signal. Of course. They had probably activated a local jammer. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain they could hear it from the doorway. Then a thought struck me. The notebook. The one I had thrown in the parking garage. I hadn't just thrown away my notes. I had thrown away the only leverage I had. But wait, that wasn't my only notebook. I had a digital backup. Months ago, terrified by the patterns I saw in Elena's courtroom, I had started a cloud-synced document, encrypted and hidden behind a double-layered login. I had sent the access key to Marcus Thorne's defense attorney, a man I trusted, just in case something ever happened to me. If I could get to a public terminal, if I could just get out of this block. I saw a flickering neon light at the end of the alley, a subway entrance. If I could make it there, I could disappear into the crowd. I checked my bag again, heart sinking. My keys were gone, lost in the scuffle. Then my fingers brushed against a small, hard object in the side pocket. A backup flash drive. It was my insurance policy. If I made it out, the story would reach the press. I moved, low and fast, hugging the shadow of the brick buildings. I reached the chain-link fence and began to climb. My fingers caught on the wire, tearing the skin, but I pulled myself up. Just as I reached the top, a pair of headlights swept across the alley, illuminating the fence like a stage. "There!" A bullet whizzed past my ear, embedding itself into the brick wall with a sickening thud. I threw myself over the top of the fence, the barbs catching my jacket, ripping the fabric and grazing my shoulder. I hit the pavement on the other side hard, rolling to break the impact. I scrambled up and sprinted toward the subway entrance, my lungs screaming. I burst through the turnstile, ignoring the bewildered looks of the commuters, and dove onto the platform just as the doors of the arriving train were sliding shut. I jammed my shoulder into the gap, forcing the doors to bounce back. I stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor as the train lurched into motion. I was safe. I was out. Or so I thought. I looked up, trying to compose myself, and saw him, standing at the far end of the subway car, watching me with an expression of cold, predatory interest, was a man in a trench coat. He wasn't one of the two from the basement. He was someone else. He caught my eye, and instead of reaching for a weapon, he reached into his coat and pulled out a photo. He held it up so only I could see it. It was a picture of me, and beside it was a picture of my brother, who lived 3 states away, sitting on his front porch that morning. My blood turned to ice. He tapped the photo of my brother, then checked his watch and made a cutting motion across his throat. The train roared through the tunnel, the lights flickering, and when they came back on, he was standing directly in front of me, his shadow looming over my cowering form. "You think you're running, Miss Miller," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the screech of the tracks. "You've spent your life reporting on the law. It's time you learned that in this city, the only law is the one we write. And right now, your brother is waiting for a phone call that is never going to come." I reached for my phone, but he snatched it from my hand, crushing it under his heel. The screen shattered, and the device went dark. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of cloves and cold steel. "You have one choice. Get off at the next stop, walk out the front doors, and wait for the sedan that will be idling at the curb. If you don't, the story doesn't just end with you. It ends with everyone you've ever loved." The train began to slow, the station lights approaching. I looked at the closing doors, then at the man. I had the flash drive in my pocket, but it was useless if I couldn't reach a computer. I had to decide, save myself and the story, or save my brother and become a permanent prisoner of the very network I had tried to expose. As the train screeched to a halt, the doors slid open, revealing a dark, deserted platform, and a black sedan waiting right where he said it would be. He gestured for me to step out, his hand hovering near his jacket, waiting for me to make the final move of my life. I didn't step out. I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, fused to the grime-slicked floor of the subway car. The man in the trench coat didn't blink, his expression as frozen and soulless as a mannequin in a shop window. He took a step toward me, his hand slipping inside his coat, and I absolutely knew, that if I didn't move, he would kill me right there in the empty flickering light of the subway station. "Last chance, Clara," he whispered, the name feeling like a curse on his tongue. "The car won't wait forever, and neither will the people holding the leash on your brother." My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but every logic center in my brain paralyzed me with the image of my brother. I reached deep into my pocket, my fingers brushing the cold, jagged edge of the flash drive. It was my only weapon, but it was just a piece of plastic. I looked at the man, then at the open subway doors, and then at the dark, yawning abyss of the station exit. In a moment of pure, reckless adrenaline, I didn't step out. I lunged forward, not at him, but at the control panel next to the door. I slammed my elbow into the emergency door override, the alarm blaring with a high-pitched, piercing shriek that echoed off the tunnel walls. The doors hissed, shuddered, and slammed shut just as the man reached for my collar. He missed by an inch, his hand catching only the empty air as the train jerked back into motion, tearing away from the station and leaving him standing there on the platform, his face contorted in a mask of pure, murderous rage. I collapsed into a seat, my breath coming in jagged, wheezing sobs. The train sped into the dark tunnel, accelerating toward the next stop. I was still alive, but I had made an enemy, a powerful, connected enemy who knew exactly who I was and where my family lived. The flash drive felt like a burning coal in my pocket. I had to get to a public terminal, but how? Every camera, every monitor in this city was likely tied to the very network I was trying to burn down. I stayed on the train for 3 stops, changing cars at every opportunity, hiding behind the pillars, scanning the faces of every commuter. The city felt like a spider web, and I was the fly trying to chew through the silk. I finally got off at a crowded central terminal, the kind of place where you could disappear in plain sight. I found an old, outdated kiosk in the back of the terminal, a dusty relic that hadn't seen an update in years. It had an exposed USB port and a clunky, wired connection that likely wasn't linked to the city's high-tech surveillance grid. I sat at the terminal, my hands shaking so violently I could barely type. I plugged in the drive. The screen flickered, a progress bar loading the files. Evidence, organized scheme, financial ledger, audio logs, emails. It was all there. I navigated to a secure, anonymous file-sharing site, the kind used by whistleblowers, and began the upload. 10%, 20%. I watched the percentage climb, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. A group of teenagers walked by, laughing, completely oblivious to the fact that I was holding the key to a city-wide conspiracy. 50%. Suddenly, the screen went black. A cursor blinked in the center of the dark monitor. A message began to type itself out in bright, malicious green text. "We see you, Clara. The upload is being diverted. You aren't saving anyone." My heart stopped. They had me. They weren't just monitoring the network, they were inside it. They were tracing the signal from this very terminal. I yanked the flash drive out, but the message remained, burning into the screen. I turned to run, but the terminal's speakers crackled to life, a low, distorted voice filling the quiet corner of the terminal. "Did you really think you could win, Miss Miller?" the voice asked, booming through the small, crowded space. "You're not a journalist. You're a liability, and liabilities are always dealt with." I bolted from the terminal, weaving through the dense crowd of commuters. I needed to reach the streets to find a place where I could hide, but as I reached the exit, I saw them. Not the man in the trench coat, but 2 officers in full uniform, their hands hovering over their holsters. They weren't looking for a suspect. They were looking for me. I ducked into a nearby restroom, locking myself in a stall and pulling my knees to my chest. My phone was dead, my backup was compromised, and the entire city police force was likely being fed my description. I had nowhere left to run. I leaned my head against the cool tiles of the stall, tears streaming down my face. Was this how it ended? Was Marcus Thorne going to be the only one who got a fair trial, while I was silenced in the dark? Then a soft tapping came on the stall door. 3 rhythmic knocks. "Clara?" a voice whispered. A woman's voice, calm and surprisingly familiar. "Open the door. I'm not with them. I'm the one who's been feeding the internal security office the information on Elena Vance. I know about the flash drive, and I know how to get you to your brother before they do." I looked at the floor, seeing a pair of sensible heels and a slip of paper being slid under the door. I picked it up. It was a badge, not for the police, but for the very internal security office that had arrested Elena. But it was marked with a red symbol I had never seen before. "Who are you?" I whispered through the door. "The one who's going to finish what you started," the woman replied. "But you have to move now. They've already breached the terminal you were using. If you don't open this door in 5 seconds, you're dead." I looked at the locked stall door, then at the badge on the floor and reached for the latch. As the door swung open, I didn't see the woman I expected. I saw someone who shouldn't have been there, someone who'd been dead for 10 years, someone whose face was plastered on a memorial in the center of the courthouse lobby. My pulse stopped as she smiled, and the bathroom lights flickered out, plunging us into total darkness. The darkness in the restroom was absolute, thick enough to taste. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, as the woman stood there, her outline barely visible against the faint, flickering light of the hallway outside. My breath hitched. This was impossible. The woman standing before me was Sarah Thorne, Marcus's sister, the woman who had been the chief witness in a high-profile case a decade ago, the woman who had died in a tragic car accident shortly after testifying, or so the official records claimed. "You're dead," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Records are just ink on paper, Clara," she replied, her voice cool and steady. "And the people who wrote those records, the ones who run this city, are very good at making problems disappear. But I'm not a problem. I'm the ghost in their machine." She grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly firm, and pulled me toward the service exit behind the mirrors. As we squeezed through the narrow maintenance corridor, she explained everything in rapid, whispered bursts. She hadn't died. She had been extracted. She had spent the last 10 years gathering intelligence from the inside, building a case against the very organized scheme that Elena Vance had fronted. The internal security team I had encountered wasn't a secret police force for the law. They were the enforcement arm of a rival faction within the scheme, trying to purge the old guard, like Elena, to take full control. "They aren't trying to clean up the city," she whispered, guiding me through a maze of pipes and dark corridors. "They're trying to centralize the corruption. Elena was an asset, but she became reckless. My goal has always been to bring the whole thing down. Every judge, every politician, every shadow player. You just happened to catch a piece of the puzzle that was too big for them to ignore." We emerged into a cluttered, windowless room filled with monitors. It was a digital fortress. I saw screens flashing with bank transfers, internal communications, and incriminating photos of the city's elite. My breath caught as I saw the file I had been uploading, the one they claimed to have diverted. It was already live on a secure, untraceable public server. The upload had finished. They didn't divert it, I realized, staring at the screen. They were bluffing to scare me. "Exactly," Sarah said, typing rapidly. "Fear is their best weapon, but now it's our turn to use it." She hit a final key, and the screens changed. Suddenly, the city's news outlets, the social media feeds, and the official courthouse portals began to refresh automatically. The evidence of the organized scheme, the financial ties to the weapons trafficking, and the proof of judicial bribery were broadcasting to every screen in the city. The names of the judges, the prosecutors, and the high-ranking officials involved were being exposed in real time. Outside, I could hear sirens. Real ones this time. A massive wave of federal investigators, not the corrupt local ones, was swarming the courthouse and the administrative offices. I watched on the monitors as agents in windbreakers stormed the very rooms where Elena had sat in judgment just hours before. The chaos was complete. The iron grip of the scheme was shattering. "What about Marcus?" I asked, my voice finally steadying. "He's already been moved," Sarah said, pointing to a monitor showing a secure transport vehicle leaving the detention center. He's on his way to protective custody. The case against him is being dismissed as we speak. The truth is officially on the record now. I stood there, feeling the weight of the last 24 hours drop from my shoulders. The corrupt judge, the men in gray suits, the threats against my brother, it was all unraveling. My phone, which I had somehow held onto through the madness, vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a text from my brother. Just got a call from the bureau. They say I'm safe. What's happening? I looked at Sarah. She was already fading into the shadows of the room, her silhouette merging with the equipment. Wait, I called out. Where are you going? I don't exist, Clara, she said, a sad smile touching her lips. I never did. That's the only way to keep doing what needs to be done. You're the reporter. Tell the world what really happened. Make sure they don't get the chance to bury it again. And with that, she was gone, leaving me alone in the dim light of the server room. The screen in front of me showed a live feed of the courthouse lobby. A crowd had gathered, and as the officials were marched out in handcuffs, the people were cheering. I saw the faces of the people Eleanor had mocked, the victims she had looked down upon. They were all there, witnessing the collapse of an empire built on arrogance and deceit. Weeks later, the city was a different place. The trials of the century were underway, and this time there was no performative mockery from the bench. Elena Vance was behind bars, not presiding, her influence burned away by the relentless light of public truth. I sat in the back of the courtroom for the final hearing, my notepad open, but I wasn't just recording events anymore. I was writing the story of how a single terrified court reporter and a ghost from the past had toppled a mountain. The gavel came down, but it didn't sound like a threat this time. It sounded like a new beginning. I looked over at Marcus Thorne, who was sitting in the front row, his face finally free of the weight of an unjust accusation. He caught my eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the storm we had weathered. I looked down at my page, wrote the final line of my article, and closed the notebook. The law was broken, and it would take years to heal. But for the first time in my career, justice wasn't just a word in a transcript. It was something I had helped create. As I walked out into the warm, clear air of the afternoon, I knew the shadows would always exist, but they wouldn't own the light ever again. The trial of the judge was over, and the era of the truth had finally arrived.